Anybody who's tried to pitch a book knows how long that process takes. Trigger Guard is a very niche book. It's not going to be a New York Times bestseller. Well, I hope it becomes, but it will never be to that level. It isn't like fiction. So sending it down the fiction route and trying to pitch it and trying to sell it to one of the houses would have kept the book from the public and from writers who possibly need it much longer than I wanted to wait.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Chris Grall, a retired U.S. Special Forces team sergeant and firearms consultant, about From Firearms to Fiction, including his book Trigger Guard, A Writer's Guide to Firearms. Chris shares the challenges he faced in creating consistent and accurate illustrations for his book, with some valuable do's and don'ts for authors with books that include illustrations, the attitude he brought to receiving feedback from his target audiences, and the goal of his book, to enable writers to write gripping and accurate firearms scenes. And a quick request before we get to the interview: if you've gotten value from the podcast, please leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform to help others find it. And now let's hear from Chris Grall about From Firearms to Fiction. Hello, fellow book lovers, both readers and writers. This is the point where normally I would say either welcome to the Indy Author podcast or welcome to my video series, What I Learned. But this conversation is going to be a little bit different because we are going to have the conversation with my lovely guest and then see where it goes. And so my guest is Chris Grall. Hey, Chris, how are you doing?
Hi, Matty. How's it going?
Great. I met Chris, good heavens, Chris, you were a guest way back in episode 12 of the Indy Author podcast.
I'm an OG, original gangster.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yes, you are an original gangster. One of the first dozen guests. And actually less than that because I was a guest on the first one. But way back there, Chris did the first Mistakes Writers Make episode, which was Mistakes Writers Make about firearms and how to avoid them. And I recently ran into Chris at the International Thriller Writers Craft Fest. We agreed that it was about time that he came back to the podcast, but we decided to use the format of the What I Learned series. And the What I Learned series is a separate series I do from the podcast where I ask authors 2 questions related to their latest book. And so we're going to get to those questions in a moment. But first, I would like to introduce you to Chris. Chris Grall is a retired U.S. Special Forces team sergeant with 26 years of service. In 2007, he served as a technical advisor for Scott Sigler's book Contagious, and since then he shared knowledge of firearms with authors via his consulting business TactiQuill and at conferences. And Chris's first book, Trigger Guard, A Writer's Guide to Firearms, covers the function and operation of small arms from the musket to the machine gun, loaded with graphics and diagrams. We're going to be talking about that. This guide gives authors the tools they need to avoid making firearms mistakes. So now you have a whole book, not just a podcast episode, but a whole book of how you can avoid these questions. So, Chris, let's just start right out with the question of the first of the What I Learned questions, which is, what did you learn from Trigger Guard that you would like to share with your fellow writers?
Never illustrate your own book. So I did almost all of the illustrations in the book. And the problem with a book like Trigger Guard is you want to teach everybody what the firearms do, all the different types. And you can pluck this image from over here and that image from over there. But, I would have to get like 3 or 4 pictures of every different type of gun I wanted to talk about. And it was just easier to, and a whole lot cheaper, to make the graphics myself. And when I made them in PowerPoint, I can take a group of the PowerPoint pieces that I made and move them around so that I can show a gun with the slide locked back to the rear, and it would be consistent with all my other drawings. But it was painful. It would take me at least 2 or 3 hours just to do a single firearm. And I think there are 100 and something drawings in there. It was horrible.
So were you actually taking here's the circle element, and now I'm going to put that here. Now here's the rectangle element. I'm going to put that there. Is that what you mean by you created it in PowerPoint?
Yes. So I had an overall picture of the gun, and some of them are my own. and I would draw the frame, and then I'd draw the slide, and then I'd draw the hammer if it had a hammer, and the safety, and all of the different elements as a PowerPoint object. And then all I would have to do is change the position of it to show whether the hammer was cocked or the slide was locked to the rear or anything else that I might need to put or explain for that particular firearm.
So I would think that maybe a lesson, you can draw lessons from individual learnings that you had as you were working on trigger guard. If you were doing it again, I would think that the advice would be you do 1 or 2, and then you kind of step back and say, okay, I'm spending 2 or 3 hours on each of these pictures. Is it worth it? Or is there a better way? Or can I outsource it? Or like if you were doing it again, what would you do at what point in that process?
Um, I would have examined all of the firearms that I was going to use first, and then say, okay, I'm only using these. This is the list of firearms I'm going to do, and not have read. Because if I did this one, okay, well, I need to kind of do that one too. Or I had an idea that I would do one particular firearm, but then through the editing process, that gun fell out of the book as a specific firearm I was going to talk about. And the 2 or 3 hours I spent on that firearm, they weren't necessarily wasted because I put that firearm or any firearm that fell off in the annex as a resource for authors to look at in case they ever wanted to use that firearm. But I definitely would have pared down the number that I ended up using and creating.
And I'm assuming that you couldn't take photographs because you said some of these were firearms you had or had access to, but not all of them would have been. And so I'm assuming that you didn't want an effect where 50% of them were photographs you were taking and 50% of them were drawings, which would be kind of a weird effect.
Exactly. And so the number one reason was consistency. If I have a group of firearms, they should all be from the same angle so I can show the features, the way they operate, and I don't have to worry about this picture being at a 90 or a 45-degree angle and it doesn't show what I want to show.
Right.
So if you priced out using stock images of firearms or any stock images for your book, then you know getting a licensable picture is fairly expensive. I would have had to do that for 2 pictures per firearm. All the firearms that are in the book, it would have been very, very expensive.
I can also imagine that it's sort of different than I need a picture of a sunrise. I'm going to go find a picture of a sunrise on Shutterstock. I'm going to purchase the commercial license and now I'm good to go because your pictures, the requirements you had were so specific and they almost by definition would have had to have been taken by someone else who was also a firearms expert. And so at that point, you're really kind of inviting a co-authoring relationship because the pictures are so integral to the book that if you're using someone else's pictures, it feels more like an active contribution to the creative effort than I'm going to go look for a picture of a sunset.
Right. The collaboration involved would have been extraordinary. And I had a deadline. And sure, making all the images myself was time consuming, but I have a budget and I have a deadline, and it ended up being far more easy to do it myself.
And you ended up using those PowerPoint generated pictures, but you wouldn't do it again, is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Uh, the universe heard me and laughed. If if somebody approached me and said, "Okay, this was fantastic. Why don't you do this now with all of these firearms?" I would have to take a big, long think about that. But if the market is there, if people want the work, then I'm not opposed to doing the work. It's all just stuff, but I would approach it much differently.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned another aspect that I think was another piece of advice you would have for authors, which is the deadline. Who was setting the deadline and how was that determined and how did it work out?
Well, and I haven't done this with any other work yet, but people work harder and more efficiently when they have a deadline. I had a personal deadline for Trigger Guard as being available for purchase by Thriller Fest. Now, back when I conceived the idea to make Trigger Guard, I had a year, a little under a year. And I said, okay, this is when I want it done. And everything that I did was in an effort to make that deadline. And I barely made it because, as you know, indie publishing is a process. And there are points where you are slave to the process and you have no control over how much time it takes for some things to happen. You just have to deal with it and do all those other tasks that you need to do for indie publishing.
And what was it about Thriller Fest in particular that you were using that as the deadline you were shooting for?
Well, if you're going to be at a conference and you are going to speak or participate in a panel at that conference, and you want to write, and you have the opportunity to show up with a book in hand and say, here it is, then you should work as hard as possible to get that thing done. That was the whole thing. If I'm going to show up and I want this to be a real thing, then I need to be able to promote the work at the conference.
And it doesn't sound like you ever thought about going to pitch a proposal for the book, right? You knew you wanted to go to the conference with it ready to sell.
Right. Anybody who's tried to pitch a book knows how long that process takes. Trigger Guard is a very niche book. It's not going to be a New York Times bestseller. Well, I hope it becomes, but it will never be to that level. It isn't like fiction. So sending it down the fiction route and trying to pitch it and trying to sell it to one of the houses would have kept the book from the public and from writers who possibly need it much longer than I wanted to wait. And so I decided right off the bat that, sure, for any of my fiction, I'll try to go the traditional route first. And if I can make it that way, that'd be great. But for this particular work, the faster I could get it out, the faster people could get access to it, use it, and hopefully not make mistakes.
And it does seem as if with such a specific topic, you wouldn't be pitching it to the kinds of people who, who attend writers' conferences like Thriller Fest and others, but you'd almost be going after, I don't know, maybe like people who publish nonfiction that is used for movie production or firearms organizations or something like that. It would be the niche part of it is not only an influence in terms of who you target as a reader, but who you target as a publisher as well. And this would be very, very different than if you were writing a suspense thriller or whatever.
Right. And the other thing to look at is if I went to, say, a firearm manufacturer or some sort of gun lobby to have them take over and say, we endorse this product, then I'm sure that they would want some sort of editorial control over the work. And Trigger Guard is apolitical. You will not see me in there talking about the Second Amendment, talking about NRA, talking about any of the things that are so contentious right now. All I'm doing is providing information on firearms. I don't want to make any kind of political statement with that piece of work.
That's a really great point because I think that in most cases, well, if you're pitching the big five, then the political statement you're making by pitching one of the big five is so nuanced that I don't even know how that would play out. But I imagine that the more niche a publisher you go to, the more likely it is that by affiliating yourselves with them, you are going to be making a political statement, whether you think of it or not. And so as with any publisher, you want to be researching things like, are they solvent and are they about to go bankrupt, or do they have a good or bad reputation in the industry? But that's a whole consideration I had never thought of before. Like, what brand or marketing statement are you making by affiliating yourselves with them?
Yeah, and the editorial control too.
Yeah.
Let's just say that I approached the NRA for endorsement of this work. The NRA would want to say something about the work. And then, of course, you have the political stigma of associating yourself with a different firearms group or a firearms lobby or a gun control lobby for that matter.
Right.
So to remain accessible to all writers on this particular divisive topic, I found it best to just do it myself and go indie.
So I want to return to the topic of PowerPoint for a moment, because you not only use PowerPoint to create the images, but you actually laid the book into PowerPoint. For anyone who's just listening, Chris is having a migraine right at the moment.
That was the original sin of this book, was to do the entire first draft in PowerPoint. Now, when I started writing it, I think very visually, and I knew that I wanted the picture of the gun on the page. I wanted to tell you how to load it or how it operated. I wanted that on the page as well. And I've done a lot of work in PowerPoint. I'm not a master, but I am proficient. And I thought, how hard could it be? How hard could it be? And I wrote the entire first draft page by page with each image and each element on the page purposefully placed. And with PowerPoint, it's easy. I can grab a text block and move it over here, and I can put the image over there, and everything looks great. Not so much when you try to take that PowerPoint presentation and put it into a PDF and then convert the PDF over to Word so that your editor will be able to do their work. And it was a god-awful mess. So as I wrote the first draft, I wrote it page by page. You don't write books that way. You can't write books that way, but that's the way I did it. And I remember talking to my wife, and I would say, I got 2 pages done today. You could say, I wrote 3 chapters today, or 2 chapters, or whatever. And, oh, that's fantastic. I don't know how many pages that would be, but you wrote a chapter. I wrote a page. So the original sin was working the first draft in PowerPoint. And I sent it for my content edit. And the editors just about lost their mind, because all of the formatting and all of the things that I grouped together split apart and distributed themselves wherever they wanted to go on the page. And it was just a horror show.
Yeah, I think that the good analogy for this for a lot of the listeners will be that don't worry too much about what the end product is going to look like when you're collecting the information. Just get the information captured somehow. And I would imagine this is, if you had come to me very early in the process and asked me this, the advice I would have given you, and then you can tell me if this is advice that seems sensible in retrospect, is put it all in Word, just stick the pictures in kind of where you want them to go. Keep using it in Word until you get to the until you're done with all the content. And then I think in this case, I probably would have recommended going to a professional formatter. 9 times out of 10, when I'm talking to people, even with books that have some illustrations in them. So for example, for one of my nonfiction books, Taking the Short Tack, there are some illustrations in the sense that there are like book covers shown, but it's very simple. And like, well, vellum worked fine for that. I use vellum for everything. But I can imagine that for something like that, it would have maybe been worth the expense to pay someone to take that very, very last step when you had all the content ready to go.
Well,
In retrospect, what do you think of that approach?
first off, I have my galley right here. A page like this is something I could only write by having the picture in front of me as I wrote it. I needed to be able to address what I saw. I couldn't just see it in my mind. I had to have it in front of me as I wrote it. But I'm going to call you out because I think I remember, and I would have to go through my inbox, but we had a conversation about this last year at about this time.
Yep.
And I said, I'm going to write it in PowerPoint. And you said, good luck with that.
I'm sure I said it in a very nice way, though, right?
No, it was actually said, that is an interesting idea because we had talked about it. And I said, I can set margins in PowerPoint. I can set all the things. And you said, well, I would be really interested to know how that comes out if you ever get it done. And yeah, it was a horror show, but I couldn't have written the first draft any other way.
Yeah.
And then when I went for copy edit, my copy editor, the book became so big, the Word file became so big, you couldn't email it. And then my copy editor said, just send it to us without the graphics. So I had to pull out all the graphics, send the Word file, and then it came back and I had to plug them all back in. So I was recreating the work over and over and over. And it was a horror show.
I think that, and I'm not suggesting this as like something somebody should necessarily take as gospel, but I think it's a good example of the importance of testing things out, because a way I can imagine, like looking back, if you just decided you were going to do part 2 of Trigger Guard, you could do something, for example, like have 2 columns in Word, and you would always have the text in the left column and the picture in the right column, whether or not you wanted it to look like that in the end, so that you could have the image there. You could be writing right next to it. And then if you ever needed to give somebody just the textual part, you could just make a copy and delete the column that had all the pictures in it. Now that might work or might not, but it would probably be a cool idea to say, I'm going to spend like a couple of hours experimenting with this. I'm going to spend a couple of hours experimenting with that, just so you don't commit yourself right off the bat to something that proves to be very painful in the long term. And I think that this whole conversation about like a file being too big to email brings up yet another point that I think is very easy for people, especially if they're used to writing and indie publishing text-centric books, is the delivery fees for ebooks, like on KDP, for example. And so if you had very, very high resolution images and you put them in the book, you could really be eating into your profits by having such a data intensive book. And I'm sure there's expertise out there that says, in this circumstance, if you're loading an ebook, the images don't need to be any bigger than whatever. And you could put the whatever images in one version of the book, the high quality images in the print version, whatever that is. But I think it's such a specialized area that I think this is one that I would recommend people look into expertise so you don't have to learn the lessons on your own.
I never worried about the file size for KDP because that wasn't the issue. The issue was clarity of content. And I wanted people to be able to see what we were all talking about.
Yeah. And I think that the last thing I can offer secondhand on layout is that my husband has a book of his photography from Mount Desert Island. And then there's a small amount of text associated with the different pictures. And he had a very, very specific idea of the image should be in this part of the right-hand page, and then the text should be in the upper left-hand corner or wrapping around the picture, whatever. Like, obviously, the visual effect was for each page was intended to be artistic in addition to each element on the page. And what he found was that he had a specific idea of the trim size he wanted. It did all the work, and then found out that KDP didn't offer that trim size as part. They didn't offer it at all. So he had to go, I don't know, to Lulu or BookBaby or some BookBaby, I think, because they had more flexibility in terms of trim size. But another thing that if you can just think about it in advance, you can save yourself a bunch of heartache.
I always knew I wanted to go trade paperback 6x9.
Mhm.
So fortunately, I didn't run into that issue of, oh, the trim size isn't available. Nope. I went with something that was really common that would fit on your desk and look okay in your bookshelf.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that another good sort of generalizable lesson is that idea of think about the things that you want to be different about your work that are important, and then think about the opportunities you have for taking advantage of standards, just as you're saying. You wanted it to be a standard size, and so you have eliminated a certain number of headaches as a result of that. One of the things you had called out in our earlier conversations about what we were going to talk about is getting feedback. So, can you talk a little bit about what you meant when you said that one of your learnings was that you wanted feedback?
So, um, firearms have been part of my life since I was 21 years old, a constant part of my life. So, I have a certain amount of information that I think is standard when it comes to this topic. And I forget that people don't have that same level of knowledge. It's not that I've forgotten the topic, it's that I've forgotten to inform the reader or the person I'm talking to about the steps that got me to this point. So I knew going into this that there would be topics that I think that I addressed perfectly, and that somebody will say, "Hey, what did you mean by that? Can you elaborate on this particular thing?" Or talk more on that, or clarify this point. And this book is written because of working with you, working with other authors, and all of the questions that they've had through the years have contributed to this book. At some point, I'm going to talk to more authors and get more questions. And based on feedback, based on interaction with other authors, I could easily see a second edition to this book.
Mm.
And it all depends on what kind of fuel I can get for a second edition, or maybe a second volume. I could break it up into 2 or 3 volumes if the interest is there and enough questions drive another edition or another volume.
It's an interesting perspective of looking both for that feedback from the people who whom you want to serve with the book, and then also looking for feedback from the people who are the people you might go to if you had a question yourself. Like, did you handle how you solicited and how you took in feedback differently in those two scenarios?
I had 3 groups of people I wanted feedback from. The first was authors. It didn't matter their experience with firearms. I did not care their level of knowledge with the topic. All I wanted was, "Hey, here's the book. Tell me if I answered all your questions." And the authors that responded were fantastic. They said, "Hey, yeah, I like this. I didn't like that, blah, blah, blah." The next group of people that I approached was firearms people, people that I knew or know. And I said, "Hey, you know what you're talking about. You know what you're doing. Here's my book. Tell me what I get right, what I get wrong, and what I need to elaborate on." And I got their feedback as well. And I made changes for both groups of people. And then the third group of people was people who would just read it. It's an interesting topic. The book in itself is a history lesson, not just advice for writers. How readable is it? Can you read this? Do you find this interesting? So I got feedback from 3 groups of people, but the group that really drives the content are the writers. And anybody who would buy this book for advice is going to have additional questions. And the only way they can get answered is if you send them to me, and maybe I get it into another book. I If I get something wrong, I welcome that feedback, but do it in an email, not in a review.
Yes, that's a great point. Yes. And I can imagine that if people are writing about a character who's a firearms expert and they want to make sure that the way they describe it is the actions that are taken, the language that's used, all those things are appropriate for a firearms expert. So, they can go to Trigger Guard and they can find that out. Another scenario, I think, is the one where the point of view character who's not a firearms expert and they're experiencing some event with firearms. And so, as an example, for one of my books, I had a scenario where a young teenage woman is watching this one gunman stalking another gunman, and then gunman A shoots gunman B. He takes gunman B's gun and he runs off. It's like a battle between two groups of gunmen. And so I needed to have a way to describe an action I had never seen in real life, one person shooting another person, in a way that would make sense for a teenager to describe it. So he fiddled with the gun and then he stuck it in his waistband or whatever. Like, she's not going to know the terminology of whatever the gunman is doing when he's fiddling with the gun. She's just going to be able to describe it like that. But I didn't want to rely on movies for that description because I don't know what the movie is going to get wrong. So I think that this idea of how do you describe expert topics, but from the point of view of a non-expert point of view character, is a really interesting angle.
Well, so in the book, things like never do this, don't do this, don't do this. And I mean that for the writer. Clips versus magazines. I know. Everybody just rolled their eyes and they're like, come on, not this again. And I agree. A clip is a device that holds ammunition that you use to load a magazine. A magazine loads a gun. Done. The writer cannot get that wrong. The character can. So if I was a person that was in a gang or in street life or whatever, I could very well use the wrong terminology, clip instead of magazine, all my life. And for that character, it's perfect. The narrator cannot make that mistake. So as a writer, you need to find a way to let the reader know that I know the difference between A and B. My character, for that character, this is appropriate.
Right.
And that's a challenge because it goes to character, and you can make those, your character can make the mistakes, you, the writer, cannot.
Right. I guess another flavor of that would be the scenario where, like, I think an error in any kind of fictionalized depiction of guns is that the characters do something wrong, but the effect is what would happen if they did it right. And so it's hard to find sources that say if the person does it wrong, what's the actual effect of doing it wrong? You know, holding a gun a certain way or using a certain kind of ammunition or shooting behind your back or might be.
Using two guns.
Using two guns, yeah.
Horrible. Never use two guns. Never, never. Now, if it's an over-the-top piece of fiction, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
But if you've got a realistic book and you've got a trained expert, they are not going to use two guns at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Not going to work.
Yeah.
If you don't know firearms and you see a firearms scene in a movie, so let's go back to your example. You have a character who doesn't know firearms, but they're watching a gunfight. You can watch any gunfight on the TV or in a movie and say, how would I describe this if I didn't know what I was seeing? And that's perfectly fine because it doesn't matter if you get it wrong from that character's perspective. And if it's a POV character telling the scene, then you can make any kind of mistake you want as long as it comes from the character.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it really depends on the specificity of the scenario. There's an error that I see all the time where a gun clicks. He pulled the trigger and the gun clicked empty. Okay. What type of firearm was it? Now, for the majority of your semi-automatic pistols and most semi-automatic rifles, when the gun is empty, it's not going to click. It's just not going to happen. So when I hear the gun clicked empty and I know that the firearm was a specific type, then I think, well, that's an error and that's a mistake. So knowing the exact elements that are in the story, the factors that comprise the scene really drives what is a mistake and what isn't a mistake in any book that involves firearms.
Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
give you gun A, it will click when empty, but only once. I can give you gun B, it won't click at all.
I have acted on the advice that you gave. I think that was advice you shared back in episode 12 about you want to know the details, and then maybe there's a point at which more detail isn't good. And I know not just for firearms, but just for things in general. A lot of times I'll put a lot of detail in an early version of a scene, and then I'll go through and pick out and pull out the things that you really don't need that much information, because every little detail you put in is either an opportunity to get it wrong, or even if you don't get it wrong, an opportunity for some reader to go, "Is that really how that is?" And then they go, like, Google it to see if you are right or not. And so just that lesson that more detail and more detail and more detail is not necessarily a desirable outcome.
I like generic actions with specific firearms. You're going to load a gun, you're going to fire a gun, you're going to aim the gun, you're going to unload the gun, you're going to holster the gun. That's good enough for most scenes.
Yeah.
Where you want to get gritty and talk about process, well, then you need a whole lot of really technical elements, and those technical elements are not really good for an action scene. They're
Right.
great for a training scene. I can demonstrate proficiency in a training scene. And then in the action scene, you chop all of that stuff out and you go with the raw emotion of what you're doing in that scene.
Yeah.
You know, it's really interesting. When I wrote the advice for writing gunfights chapter in the book, I did 3 case studies. And one of them was the assassination attempt of Harry Truman. 2 men tried to assassinate Harry Truman while he was staying in this place while the White House was being remodeled. And one of them had 0 experience with semi-automatic pistols. And he rolled into this gunfight with a firearm he had never used. And it changed the whole outcome of the assassination attempt. So very interesting. There are elements in that very specific 44 seconds of gunfight that anybody who's writing a gunfight should look at and say, oh, well, that's interesting, because one of the bad guys had to reload. One of the good guys suffered a mortal wound and fought through it and killed the other bad guy. One guy received hardly any wounds at all and fell over on the ground because he thought he was mortally wounded. There were so many different things that happened in that particular event that could fuel fictitious gunfights for years.
Well, that's reminding me of at the end of this gunfight scene I was describing in the Lizzie Ballard book. Lizzie ends up picking up a gun, and she looks at it and she doesn't know if the safety's on. She doesn't know if the safety is not on. She doesn't even know what the safety is. And she has this fractional moment of thinking, should I try pointing it at somebody and pulling the trigger? And instead she throws it in a chest freezer and jumps on top of the freezer, on the theory that in that moment, all she can think to do is do everything she can to keep it out of everybody's hand, not use it herself. And I thought, obviously you wouldn't do that if it was like a police officer who had picked it up, or a bank robber, or somebody who knew what they were doing. But if they don't know what you were doing, she was just like, no, it's just better for me to get rid of this.
Yep.
Yeah. So I want to ask you the other question as kind of closeout. Let's switch to the other question that is part of the What I Learned series, which is, what did you learn that you would like to share with your fellow readers?
Well, I've learned a whole bunch that goes to the writers, and what I'd like readers to know about this is the book is meant for anyone in the full array of firearms experience can pick up this book and use it. So you could use it as a resource where you thumb back and forth between the different sections that you need. And you can also read it from cover to cover and build your knowledge base through the evolution of firearms, the evolution of ammunition, how they're used, how they malfunction, a writer's guide, and then it ends with advice on writing a gunfight. So you can read this straight through if you know nothing about guns. I wanted you to be able to pick it up and read it all the way through and say, I can do this. And if you do have knowledge and you just need to look up that one detail, you can use it as a resource for that. I use it. I have a PDF copy on my desktop here, and I am always looking stuff up because I put things in the book that I didn't want to have to keep looking up. Go on the Google machine and find that one thing that I always forget. No, it's in the book, and it's right there on the left-hand side of my screen. And all I have to do is open it up, go to that page, and go, yeah, that's right. That's what that does.
Probably the ultimate test for any nonfiction writer is if you find you can use your work as a reference for yourself as well. So cool. Well, Chris, as always, it is lovely chatting with you. And please let everyone know where they can find out more about you and Trigger Guard online.
Okay, so you can find me at chrisgrall.com. And I've started a website for Trigger Guard that is trigger-guard.com. And then, of course, there's my consulting side, tactiquill.com, TactiQuill.com. And you can get a hold of me through any of those means.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Matty.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Chris. Do you include illustrations in your books? And if yes, what challenges have you faced in the production of the book? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.